is something that can be a ground. That ground could be a self, if you're kind of oriented towards consciousness. That ground could be an objective bedrock of reality if you're oriented towards reality, or wider reality outside of consciousness. That turns out to be a mental frame. If you do the phenomenological analysis, you do the contemplative practices, you do the philosophy, I'm utterly convinced that reality itself is totally groundless. It's totally just kind of, it's like an expression in the infinite, you could say.
Welcome to another episode of the Anagoge Podcast. Today, I have the guest, James Cooke. So I've been looking at some of his material. It's very interesting stuff. He was kind enough to accept the invitation, and actually found out later that we're in the same country because I'm from Portugal. I was visiting here, family. So it's just a very nice coincidence. And we figured that we would do the first Anagoge Podcast live. So welcome, James. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it was great to be here.
Yeah. So maybe before we start, just give like a quick intro about yourself, just a little bio, type of work you've done, and yeah, just everything about kind of your intellectual professional life.
Yeah. So I'm a neuroscientist by training, but my intellectual interest in the stuff that I talk about goes back many years before I trained as a neuroscientist. It really began with a spontaneous shift in experience as a teenager, which we can talk about. But that really helped relieve a lot of suffering and open up some well-being, but was also really a state of insight, it felt, into the way the world is, insight into our existential situation. And I think that's what the terrain of, you could say, kind of contemplative practices, meditation, it's all about, to me, reckoning with our existential situation. So that really set the ball rolling. I trained as a scientist because, yeah, that was my kind of orientation. And then I recently wrote this book, The Dawn of Mind, which really takes my scientific work on consciousness and combines it with a more philosophical worldview, both around the nature of reality, the role of science. And the reason it focuses on consciousness is a really key piece of the puzzle to figuring out what the heck is going on. You know, something seems to be going on right now. And that seeming is happening in consciousness. So consciousness is a good place to start if you want to start to figure out what is reality, what are we, what's our relationship to reality, all that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. And why did you have kind of like a scientific inclination? Because like you had your experience quite young, so like it's quite natural to expect that maybe that would have led you to believe that maybe science doesn't have all the answers. So like what made you go to this particular path?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So this experience, you could call it a spontaneous mystical experience. In Buddhism, it would be called an awakening, or kensho in Zen. And it happened through a very intense rumination on, you could say, on theology, but really I was just a 13-year-old stressed out about the possibility of hell and trying to figure out what to do about that. So I was raised Catholic, and the way I tried to approach that problem was through thinking, was through really just investing a lot of energy into thinking, okay, there's hell. Apparently I'm going to go there because I don't have blind faith. I was already scientifically minded. I think just combination of genetics and whatever at that point. For whatever reason, I couldn't believe something it just didn't make any sense to me to believe something with no reason to believe it. And so it was on ruminating on that issue, that paradox, as they do in Zen Buddhism, where you kind of ruminate on a koan, which is like an insoluble riddle. The thinking couldn't find a solution because there wasn't a solution in thought. And then I think on a very physiological level, I think the shift happened in my brain where obviously I can't prove this because I wasn't in a brain scanner at the time, but from what we know from the science of meditation and psychedelics now, it would very much fit with an idea that, yeah, the investment in that paradigm of simulating yourself as a person on a journey through time and in the world of thought, which structures our experience of the world, that all collapsed. And what was seen to be most real is in this present moment, there's a kind of unfolding in experience in this present moment. And actually time can't be found there. Space can't be found there. It's all totally immediate and totally without separations. And that wasn't something I thought. That's just really, when you stop thinking, that's really obvious that reality is just utterly simple, in a way that's very liberating because suffering plays out through the thinking. So with that experience, there was nothing about it that seemed supernatural. There was nothing about it that made me think I needed to look elsewhere than science. And I think actually, because it's a reckoning with reality, it fits well with science. So from that point on, I guess I just became curious about, well, this feels utterly real. Science supposedly studies the real. And then I looked into the science and it all just added up. So it just kind of was like, great, this is, and I think on some level as well, my suffering hadn't been helped by the presence of the current landscape of religious practices. And so I was like, there's something missing. Like, there's good stuff here for relieving suffering, and it's not being successfully broadcast. Like, I think the suffering me as a teenager wanted to live in a world where someone could stand up and be like, hey, here's a textbook on suffering and how to relieve it. And here's our understanding of reality and consciousness. And that was missing. And so I guess it became this lifelong journey to try and be that person, to try to be like, okay, how can we put all these puzzle pieces together so that the me who's a teenager now who's suffering, can actually go on a journey to relieve that suffering through understanding their relationship to reality. So all of that just meant never for a second did I think there was any reason to turn my back on science. Right.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So before we dive deeper, maybe let's just try to give like a broad overview of kind of the overall thesis that you present in the book. So it doesn't need to be very in depth because we'll come across several topics, but maybe just like a 5-minute overview of what you're trying to describe in the book.
Yeah. So I think the broad strokes are quite simple of the book, but there's a lot of detail in there because the idea is we have a whole framework of how we think about the world in science and contemporary philosophy, and I'm offering a different framework. And so I need to carry the reader from the precise details of the current framework and explain how I'm changing them. But when you take my framework as a whole, I think it's quite simple in that if you start with reality, as I mentioned with this experience, when you stop dividing the world up through concepts, through thinking, through object perception, it's obvious that reality itself is whole, not separated, and that separations only exist in perception. And that's a big shift from like our usual way of seeing the world is, no, I live in a world of objects. I live in a world of genuinely separate things, like a pile of different things. An atom is one thing, another atom is another thing. But that's just the way our minds work to kind of try to segment up reality. And so when you understand the place of object perception in doing this segmenting in the kind of stack of reality, you can see that reality itself doesn't have separations. So it's fundamentally unitive. And then from there, we can get into, there are some subtleties around what I think the nature of that reality is. One actually important aspect is that I think it's fundamentally relational, which means that everything, only interactions exist, you could say. Only, relations. And this is something that's very hard for our object perception mode, the way that we see the world. It's hard to grasp this because the whole point of object perception is it distills things into things, and that makes it really easy to approach them. But when you see that there actually aren't separate things, there's only a web of like a house of cards, is like a web of interactions. That's much harder for our minds to kind of understand. But when you entertain this possibility, everything starts to stack up, in my opinion, which is kind of what I do in the book. I point to things like Carlo Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics, which is exactly the same kind of picture. It's relational. It's pure interactions with those things doing the interacting. And that makes a lot of sense for quantum mechanics. I look at contemplative traditions that have the same kind of metaphysics, as does Rovelli. So that's my fundamental commitment to what I call non-dual naturalism. And the non-dual means non-separation. You're not splitting things into two. Everything's just, you could say one, but non-dual is a bit more precise. Because saying there's one thing also requires a kind of object perception framing. So you have this wholeness, it's fundamentally relational. And now the consciousness piece is, with that worldview, if you ask, where does consciousness fit in? From a view of separation like we currently have, it's easy to think, well, perhaps consciousness is something taking place in my personal brain, separate from the world inside my skull. Perhaps it's even more removed from the world in that it's a computation. It's some ephemeral, computation running that's something totally different to physicality. So that's a view on separation that's quite mainstream. And what I'm saying is, in a relational world, I think the mind is also a form of relationship. And if that's the case, it has to be the kind of bodily relationship between an organism and its environment. Its way of interacting, it's kind of like an epistemic or knowledge-related way of interacting. So in this view, it's a monistic view in that there's only one thing that exists, relations. And sometimes we call that physics when it's in this space in between us that we can study. And sometimes we call those minds when it's in this space that we know from the first person as a relationship to the wider world.
Yeah, awesome. That was a great breakdown. And just coming back a little bit to your childhood experience, like something that I'm quite curious is, because I've talked a lot on psychedelics. It comes up with my episodes fairly frequently. I also wrote a book on psychedelics. And a question that I get from people all the time, especially from people that are not too much in philosophy or interested in psychedelics at all, is why should you have any kind of belief about, what you just experienced on a psychedelic experience? So I'm curious for you, like two things. Like one is, while you had the experience, like when you were a teenager, like how did you justify to yourself the epistemic weight of the experience? And then how did that change, if it did at all, like once you get a bit more educated and you have neuroscience training?
Yeah, so this is quite nuanced terrain. So the experience itself required no justification, because so everything you just described, doubt, thinking, assessing, worrying about whether something's true or not, that all takes place in thought. And so when the thoughts are, you could say that, sometimes it's a case of thinking just stopping, but sometimes it's just a case of not believing the thoughts. Thoughts can still arise, but you just don't believe the content. And so when that happens, as in these experiences, we're out of the realm of verifying claims, and we're in the realm of really, this is why spirituality and contemplative practices are not just intellectual endeavors. It's really about suffering and about our relationship to the world. And so it's a state of visceral freedom that doesn't require any justification. To go back to the mind to try to justify it is the obscuration of it, because it's the freedom that's just this moment as it is before we overlay thought on it. So that's the case on the kind of, if one's interested in relieving suffering, that's important to know that if you're going to stay in thought, you're kind of, you're potentially obscuring it. Now, that's not to sidestep the question, because then there are interesting intellectual discussions to have about, well, if this is a genuine insight into the way the world is, then we should be able to import it into science. And a bridging insight there is that in this state, it's not that, so a related insight could be that there is no self, no thing that inhabits the body. That's a very related thing, because it turns out that the self is a thought. The self is an idea, that there is an organism, there's a bodily process, but the idea that there's a James inside here somewhere is just a mental construct. So that's really the core of this stuff. I was saying all thoughts can kind of fall away, or you can not believe them, but that's the really important thought when it comes to suffering, to not believe. And so in that state, the person who's had the no self experience and has felt the liberation of that, they've not suddenly, one gets a sense that, or you could say the whole system gets a sense that death is no longer a problem, because the thing you thought was going to die is not going to die. The body is like a wave made of the water of the ocean. And so when the wave dissipates, the water of the ocean will still be there. So if your true nature is the water of the ocean, who cares about the death of the body? Well, the fantasy is that there's like a surfer on the wave. That's what it is to feel like a self, is we impute some thing that we're worried will die. And that thing isn't there. So even though the body will die, there is no separate self that will die. So when you have that insight, it's not that you become a kind of a moron who no longer cares about death and just chooses not to think about it. It's not that you've just deluded yourself. You still are an evolved organism that really cares on a visceral embodied level about death. So when you have this experience, it feels really obvious that it's an insight state, and that it's the genuine insight that's led to the embodied kind of no longer being anxious about death. So if you told me there was a snake in this room and I felt some tension around that, and then I looked everywhere and became convinced that you'd lied to me. And I was just like, you know what? I've now had the insight. There never was a snake in this room. I don't need to be afraid of the snake. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where it's not like you're like, I'm just going to choose not to believe it. I'm just going to choose not to think about it. I'm going to, it feels like insight. Now, that still doesn't take us to the final piece, which is, sure, all of that's true, but you could still be mistaken. There could be a snake in the room and you just haven't found it. You could be calling off the search too early. Maybe it's not genuine insight. And that's where we do get into the realm of science and philosophy. And I guess you a lot of that in the book. Multiple people now are claiming this in neuroscience, that it makes sense to think, the way I would articulate it is, it makes sense to think of us as a fundamentally decentralized, self-organizing process. And there's some centralization that happens in the brain, but nothing in that is a self. Nothing in that is a top-down controller that is the seat of the you. The way that we understand perception works and building of concepts, the whole thing stacks up to justify the Buddhist idea that there is no self, basically, with modern cognitive neuroscience. And then philosophically, and then when you get into relational quantum mechanics, it all just stacks up together to make sense. And so the final piece here is, if you want to be truly thorough about what I'm saying, is I'm using here a kind of an epistemology, a way of justifying one's beliefs that also blends into a kind of philosophy of science, which is that the best we can do when we're trying to figure out what's going on is to look out for, to have ideas about what's going on in the world, and then look out for evidence aligning with those ideas. We never directly validate anything. We have a theory, we test the theory in science, and we get into a kind of groove of like, okay, we're on the right track here. Perception works the same way. I think being a living thing works the same way. All knowledge is this game of guessing and receiving evidence. And so you get onto this kind of signature, it's like in experience, there's this signature of this like epistemic quality of like, I'm on the right track here. That's the best we can do in terms of knowledge gathering. And so the point of the book really is to say, once you hold these models, everything starts to align up, and that seems to be the signature of truth. So you can never 100% verify anything. There's always the possibility of solipsism, that it's just this mind and there's nothing outside of it. You can't logically disprove that. But yeah, so that's the way I think about all this stuff stacking up to think this is a reasonable thing to claim. Whereas if I try on the conventional way of thinking, the naive realist way of thinking, where I'm a self in a body and the world's made of objects, there's a lot of problems. The hard problem of consciousness, quantum mechanics doesn't make sense. There's a lot of problems. Whereas this view, I'm claiming, to me, I don't see any problems. It all seems to basically add up together.
Right. When you mention the issue of the self, like something that I've been thinking about the last few years is that I'm wholly on board with kind of like this process, like oriented thinking, which also got very popular in the 20th century. But something that I think I find a bit weird, I'm not sure if it's a contradiction, but I think it's at least something to be interesting about, which is a lot of the claim about the self, which is like the self that is not a thing that you can find. You certainly can't find it in the brain, but you can't even find it like experientially. And obviously this is very old in Buddhism, but kind of in the West, this was very popularized by Hume. But then I always found it very persuasive on Kant's reply to Hume, which is something like, okay, like it's not a thing, but it's like it's the locus of everything else that is within my realm of experience, and I only have my experience. So it's like, and then what I find weird is that we're kind of saying your ontology is wrong if you're looking for substance at the bedrock of reality. So don't look for objects, look for processes. But then we're also saying, okay, the self isn't an object. It's a process, and it's not quite, well, yeah, some people wouldn't say it's a process, but you kind of see where I'm going. It's kind of like, I'm always a little bit uncertain of what to make of the claim that there's no self because of that. Like, it might be something that's very odds, ontologically counterintuitive, but it certainly makes a lot of sense based on my experience, especially from a phenomenological perspective, because like that's what everything else depends upon. And also I think that's quite important as well, because that's what has the biggest effect. Like, not only that it's experience, but also it's about the experience that I care about the most. Like it's very entrenched with the values and with everything else. So like, how do you see this issue of the self process?
So, the core way that I view this is that there's this moment that you could say is non-conceptual. It is what it is, and it can't be language. It's ineffable in terms of the raw experience on its own terms. It's relativistically you can describe things, but everything on its own term is utterly indescribable because it's just exactly itself. And language is all about relative stuff. So then from there, you get the mind frames things. It comes up with interpretations. It says, I'm here, you're there. I'm this, you're that. This is me, this is not me. That's an apple, that's an orange. It does all this kind of distinguishing, interpreting, framing. And that's the kind of the language of thought. But the problem is that we don't see it as thought or as concepts. We just think we're seeing reality. We think, so, an example I often give is, if a gardener is trying to plant some roses and they find some dandelions in there, they would call those a weed because from their perspective, a weed is defined as a plant that I don't want in my garden. That's what it is to be a weed. There is no such thing as an objective weed. Like if someone else wanted dandelions there, the dandelion would not be a weed because it's, so there's no essence of weed inside the dandelion. It just is being seen as a weed, perceived as a weed from the perspective of the gardener. Now, everything in existence is like that. Everything that seems to be a separate thing only exists conventionally and relationally through those kinds of framings. Bare reality itself doesn't have that kind of structure. And so this is the flip side of relationality is emptiness. This is what I was saying about object perception, that the weed is empty of essence of weed. And so here we get into why I think it's important for, or we would benefit from philosophers and scientists having training, scientists who study this kind of thing. If you're a chemist, maybe you don't need this, but to be trained in contemplative practices, because some of the best philosophy, in my opinion, the stuff I'm talking about now was really worked out by an Indian philosopher called Anagoge, who worked out with this kind of emptiness stuff. And that really comes from reckoning with our phenomenology, the fact that we do philosophy and science from this starting point of taking in the world here in consciousness, and then we start to try and understand the world. And so when you have a deep sensitivity to consciousness, to get to your question, you start to notice the way that you're imputing these framings that aren't actually there. And now the subtlest, I think potentially the subtlest possible frame you can have, which is really hard to get behind, is the frame that there is something that can be a ground. That ground could be a self, if you're kind of oriented towards consciousness. That ground could be an objective bedrock of reality if you're oriented towards reality, or wider reality outside of consciousness. And that turns out to be a mental frame. If you do the phenomenological analysis, you do the contemplative practices, you do the philosophy, I'm utterly convinced that reality itself is totally groundless. It's totally just kind of, it's like an expression in the infinite, you could say. And this is where you start to shade into the kind of language theologians use when you talk about mystical experiences, and you get into metaphysics, and it becomes harder to prove that. Like, I can't prove that reality is totally unbound and infinite, but it totally makes sense to me if that's the case. It would, to justify why it would be finite would be weirder for me. Like, why would it have limits, and what would be outside those limits? Anyway, so this is to say that it's this project of intellectually opening to the possibility of utter groundlessness, there not being a starting point, there not being anything that doesn't depend on everything else. Again, we're back to relationality and holism. It's a very personal project. It attacks us at our deepest, most animalistic need to try to orient. If you let this land, it's extremely disorientating, because as that foundation starts to fall away, there's no foundation, there's no experiential starting point to dualistically approach the world from. And so that's when you get into experiential non-duality, which at first is disorientating, but then feels like utter spontaneity. It's just everything just takes care of itself. The world is a big process happening. And this is where the phenomenology starts to really fit with the process stuff, that you no longer feel like you are a separate solid thing that you're afraid about the death of. Everything is just this spontaneous happening in the present moment.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. When you talk about kind of this idea of reality being infinite, like, and kind of like being inexhaustible, like that's that's something that comes up a lot in theology, like from very, very, very early. And the way that I made the most sense out of it was a little bit through Heidegger. Like when I consider that, like usually what comes to mind is two big ideas. One is that, I mean, obviously this gets a bit complicated, but generally speaking, you can think that reality is infinitely divisible, right? Like you're rounding it at some point because you just can't measure it beyond another point. And another issue is the fact that, reality is always opening up. Like it's unfolding and you can act on it. You're an agent, and it's unpredictable to some degree without getting into the whole determinism thing. But at least from your experience, there's these two issues, right? It's just kind of like you can always go smaller until you can't measure it anymore. And also it's a field of infinite possibility. But to me, where that lands the most is the reason why I got so interested in religion and kind of being, kind of recognizing that maybe science wasn't the right framework for everything, is that I saw this very heavily within a social context. It's like that way of thinking matters, and it's important, and it's like a useful tool, because if you think that way, like in your relationships and the way that you act in the world, then you see that being a benefit. But in your book, first of all, I don't think you mentioned Heidegger at all, or any other similar Ponti. I don't think you mentioned any of those. And also, I don't think you have a big, like, social or ethical dimension. So, like, when you're thinking about that reality is infinite, and all those similarities, like, first of all, like, where are you getting that from? And then, like, how do you make that relevant for your everyday life?
Yeah, so the book ends with a kind of ethical suggestion, which is very influenced by, you could say it's very aligned with Buddhism in terms of compassionate action and a sense of non-othering, non-duality around the sentience of other beings and not wanting to cause suffering. So it does get cashed out in that sense in terms of suffering. Yeah, the infinite piece, again, comes from direct experience and is a kind of core feature of many of these kinds of mystical states, whatever you want to call them. And then once you've opened to the possibility of, you could call it boundlessness, being we tend to reify infinity into, again, like an object and think infinity is some really big object, and instead it's the absence of those finite object perception bounds. So I guess when I say it's infinite, again, that word could be misleading. I'm saying it's not fundamentally framed. It's not fundamentally bound. It's not, it's a seeing that all of that is happening in the mind, and reality is just utterly free from those limits. So that's where I don't really cite other thinkers on that stuff, because it's very simple, and just, it seems to be the case prior to, once you see the place of that framing as a perceptual phenomenon, there's not much more to say about it. It's just like, that's where it exists. And before that, I don't want to make any like positive claims about, the infinite being a thing, as I say. It's more a negation. It's a non-finite. The in part of infinite is negating the finite. It's negating the existence of genuinely separate, bound things that are limited. And saying that occurs through object perception, but reality itself is not that way. And I think if you want to approach metaphysics and the nature of reality, this parallels like negative theology in theological traditions, it is wise to negate in that way, because you're dealing with our minds operating in a deluded fashion, and because of their limitations, they're never going to truly grasp the nature of reality. So it's better to kind of undercut their false delusional perspectives, and then you're left with there can be a kind of an apprehending of the way things seem to be. But again, that's through a kind of a more non-conceptual mode than going through the thinking and coming up with some positive statement about, okay, this is precisely how reality is. That's another way of saying this with the relationality is, we're so fully embedded in reality, and it's that there is actually no determinate. Reality is not a determinate object that you could step back from and have a God's eye view. It's a totally relational revelation that we're fully embedded in. So there just isn't there isn't another perspective to pull back to. And again, that's unsettling for the mind. And typically what happens there is, before it's even noticed, it's unsettling on a bodily anxiety-inducing level. And then the mind tries to manage that through thinking, through coming out, no, James must be wrong. I don't believe that. And that manages to kind of bring back down the anxiety. So that's something just for people to notice if they're dealing with intellectual terrains around contemplative practice. There's a reason those practices are there. They're not just a supplementary thing. They're kind of tuning the instrument. The instrument will misfire and come up with thoughts that are based in unconscious emotional reactivity rather than wisdom. So yeah, that's just something for people to be aware of. Right.
Yeah. And also, when you mentioned kind of this ethical dimension, like I also flirted a lot with Buddhism when I was younger, and I still have a lot of respect for it, and I try to study it as much as I can, but I ended up exploring other frameworks. But something that kind of, I never got a satisfactory answer, and I think I've seen a lot of philosophers in the West also kind of try to grapple with it, is that there seems to be a fundamental assumption. And by assumption, I don't want to be like overly negative. It's just like, it just seems linked. Might as well be true. But there seems to be this link between the fact that there isn't a self and then has a byproduct, all like the ethical teachings and the whole ethical framework of Buddhism, which is, for our purposes, let's say it's just like, be a good person in the basic sense of like almost every tradition that has this overlap. Now, the issue is that I'm not sure why that's the case. Like, I'm not sure if one follows the other. Like, I'm not sure how, if it's just like purely intuition based or what, because you can say, like, for example, even if this was provable in some way, like you could come up with someone that has like psychopathy, and you can say, here's undeniable proof that that you're not a self, you're not separate from the world, and they could very well reply, it's like, okay, but I don't care. Like, why should that be relevant to me? Like, I still have no empathy on that. So and you couldn't even argue that it's kind of like some kind of biological defect, because you could say the other way around, right? It's just like you have the defect of evolution that prompt you for group selection and whatnot. So anyway, just how do you view this thing of like jumping from no self to ethics?
Yeah, that's great terrain. So it's it relies on the negation thing again. So there's this phenomenon called alien hand syndrome, where some people have one arm that kind of attacks, just does its own thing. And there are people where they've been attacked and choked by one hand, and they're using the other hand to try and pull it away. It's a very interesting neurological phenomenon. And so the situation of feeling like a self is a bit like alien hand syndrome, where the suggestion is that there's just one thing happening. There's this unfolding reality where we all share the same nature as the energy of existence, like the wave that's made of the ocean, in the same way that my hands are equally part of the same organism. And if these hands started to kind of go to war with each other because of some belief that each one was genuinely separate, and what truly mattered was them over everyone else, that's the flavor of self, is that my journey is the journey that's really, truly important. And we don't just have this, we also have compassion, empathy. We have a balance of self-centeredness and open, selfless modes of being. But if you lean into that self mode, that is the flavor. And that's when you get into egoic issues, narcissism, psychopathy, as you say, where people are like, this is really about me. So if these hands are going to war with each other because they each believe they have, say they both thought they had a soul in them, then the soul really needed to be protected. And then they realize, no, that was just a thought. There is no soul there. Then if this hand was on fire and this hand had a glass of water, it would put it out, even if it wasn't connected by my brain, it would put it out because it would see it as another version of itself. Without that delusion of selfhood, it's like, well, we're all just the same thing. It's like, if you have apples on a tree and apples have the same ability to go to war, and they realize, actually, we're all equally apples on this tree. Like, if I care about my own suffering, it just generalizes automatically because you're not doing this additional step. So you're saying, what the insight is that suffering is bad, not my suffering, just suffering is bad. Now, it is interesting that the deepest insight is actually that it's not true that suffering is bad in any objective, actual sense. Everything just is what it is. And so the idea that suffering is bad is a subtle narrative. but it's the most robust, subtle, foundational narrative that is built into us as living things. So with Buddhism, it's a bit like you can let go of all narratives and then just see that everything just is totally as it is. And that's actually where you can get bad behavior, I think, from gurus, where they have genuine insight there, and it allows them to behave a bit psychopathically, because it actually doesn't matter what happens to anyone, because it's all just non-conceptual. That would be a story if I were to believe it mattered. So the wisdom and a lot of traditions in religion and early Buddhism have this transcendent orientation where it's like, let's just get out of all of the mess of the world of caring about, Buddhism has the ethics from the beginning. But my point is that the ethical piece is often a kind of practical human balancing of that, where there is it's more like an invitation for if you introduce the ethics, everything ends up okay, in the sense that you don't get bad behavior. You're totally right that to the psychopath, you may not be able to convince them that ethics mean anything, that there's any point to ethics. But as collectives of people, trying to reckon with our existential situation, if you add the ethics and you add the wisdom, they self-reinforce. And so it's like, I guess it's like, if you were to still be hostile to other people, there would be some subtle perception of self that you still think that actually your agenda is more important than someone else's agenda.
Yeah. When you mentioned kind of the guru problem, I was just reminded of Zizek at one point quoted kind of like how during the war the Japanese would kind of like have like really like severe like Zen training, which is like you're stabbing someone. It's like, oh, it's just a world of Maya. Like this is all irrelevant illusions. And
there's a book called Zen at War about from that. It's been my reading list for about a decade now. I should really read it at some point, because I think this is really interesting. That's exactly the term we're talking about. Yeah. Right.
But when you were mentioning kind of like that, just make sure I understand correctly. When you make this jump of, if you let go of the narratives, then you see kind of like the suffering of the other of equal importance to my own suffering. Like, do you see that as purely intuition based? Because you were saying, I can't convince, someone that has no empathy. But like, are you making like a judgment that their way of being is wrong in some way and our default one is right? And if so, like, what are you basing that on?
So these are good questions, because really it is a very simple, intuitive, instinctive, animalistic way that you move towards the belief of suffering. So if one were to go into narratives again and say, well, I've got a story that I know what's good for you and you actually don't know, and I'm going to tell you what's good for you, that would be back into the world of delusion. Whereas what we're talking about here is, if there's someone, again, like if someone's on fire, you'll put water on them. Like we all do this, right? It's was it Peter Singer had this shallow pond thought experiment, where it's like, if someone was face down in a shallow like puddle drowning, and it was trivial for you to like just roll them out, his analogy was to how trivial it is to give money to like save people who are dying from unclean water, and how it's kind of moral evil that we don't do that in those situations. I'm not getting into that terrain, but I'm saying with that specific example, we all, pretty much any human apart from a psychopath, would do the trivial action. It's like a trolley problem where there's like no downside to helping, So we all have this, and I think this probably just comes out from simple evolutionary, on the one hand, it could come from simple evolutionary things of being a social primate. On the other hand, it could be just, the recognition of our shared, before you start imputing a self, it's obvious that that suffering is bad, and so why not relieve suffering? I can't remember if that strayed from your question there. But.
Yeah, no, that's good. But but I think it's quite tricky, because obviously at that very basic level, I think it's very obvious, and most of us can agree. I don't think it can be philosophically justified, which was I was trying to kind of explore. But if it can't, I'm still happy to.
So on the intuition level, I'm very open to the like if someone showed a Buddhist monk, a very convincing hologram of a fictional person who was suffering, and they tried to help them, you're totally right. You could just get into a hall of mirrors of your own thought that you think someone's there suffering, but actually it's a trick. And there's no, so there can be misperceptions. Like instinct is totally fallible. And this is not, so I would say the ethics suffering piece, I've only approached that from a very kind of human, how I live my life level. I've not really spent any time intellectualizing it and thinking about it in terms of philosophically justifying it. That's an interesting invitation though but yeah.
Yeah. But just to maybe clarify, like the reason why I think this is so relevant is because obviously at these examples that we've been talking about, like that's very obvious. But the problem is, as things get more nuanced, then the answers aren't so easy. And so, for example, when I was younger and kind of a teenager, I also had this like I still do, but back then I even had this stronger worldview of like just reducing suffering. And a lot of times the way that I thought about it was like very, kind of utilitarian, like computational almost. It's like there's this amount of suffering and like, there's a normative, elements to it that you can't escape and you need to address it. But obviously you can't actually live that way. Like it's literally impossible. And something that you find in a lot of wisdom traditions is that they're all worried about reducing suffering, but they don't make that like a central piece that overrides everything else. So, like, for example, something that I think is quite interesting that always blows my mind is that in the Bible there's this scene where I think like some woman like gives perfume to Christ or something. And one of the disciples gets very mad. She's like, why are you giving like an expensive perfume? Like we could sell this and like give it to the poor. And Jesus says, actually, no. And I think part of the reason is because if you focus on just suffering, then I think what ends up happening is that screws your perception of reality, where then on the long term, like if you scale long enough, then you're not going to do that. And I think part of the issue about the perfume, for example, is kind of like the recognition of hierarchy, the recognition of celebration, of gift giving, which is very, very human-like and very important. So things like that. And that's why I'm worried about kind of this philosophical intuition stuff. It's just like, it's very basic at the bottom. But like when you're considering like, what should I do with my life? Like, should I sell all these cameras and like give them to the poor? And that becomes quite tricky.
Yeah. So that's exactly why I didn't touch into the, Peter Singer's argument, because there are dynamics like that when it comes to, there are reasons that giving money to billions of people is not the same as one person, drowning in a puddle. So yeah, this is great terrain. So, really what we're talking about here is utilitarian ethics based around trying to reduce suffering for the most number of people is mediated through ideas, thoughts, narratives. And so I think it is common with this kind of this Buddhist ethics to shift into a more deontological, like just do the right thing kind of in the present moment way of being. And so one may let go of grand narratives about how to relieve a lot of suffering. And anecdotally, I've seen people who go very deep on this path often will become a doctor or a nurse, some healthcare profession, which I used to have similar thoughts as to like, well, surely there's like, if you try and act at a systems level, then you have more impact. But it came to seem really palpably obvious to me that there's wisdom there in terms of, really what we're talking about with the relieving suffering is on a personal level where one feels it's wise to put one's energy. And if one is chasing your own thoughts with your own agenda based on your own self, you're trying to get some validation of what's my journey and my contribution. When that falls away, there's just, oh, there are people suffering over there. There are people in the ER who need someone to help. Maybe I'll train and try and help there. Now I'm in an interesting situation because most of my journey was operating from that first utilitarian paradigm. So I positioned myself, and my plan for the rest of my career really is to try to incorporate this understanding of our situation and suffering to try to impact systems around, like how mental health care is treated, stuff like that, integrate contemplative science into mainstream practices. And I was driven that way because I was trying to find like, what's the biggest leverage I can have to relieve suffering. And then when I got deep on the contemplative path myself, the me part of that really fell away. And I started to see the way in which you don't need to do that. But at the same time, I'm now set up to do it. So it's aligned. For me, it's aligned to try to do that where I'm currently at because I've already done the groundwork. But for someone who doesn't have the same training in science and doesn't have the same orientation, it wouldn't make sense for them to try to force reality for them to be something they're not. If someone's just you've got some random kid, in India, for example, and they decide they're going to become US president because that's the biggest influence they can have to relieve like world hunger, there's like a lot of effort that's going to have to happen. I don't even know if you can actually, maybe they even have to get the laws changed so that a naturalized citizen could become president. So like, that's probably not the way forward, perhaps. Whereas if one's a Kennedy or something, maybe that is the way forward. So there's a sense of a more instinctive, like, where am I right now, where I can go on my path to help. But yes, this is interesting for me because, as I say, the ethics has just been cashed out on that personal level, but it will be interesting to reflect on whether there can be a kind of an integration on a more philosophical level into a kind of robust justification for this. It doesn't feel it needs justifying when you settle into it personally. It's, as I say, it's more about where it feels sane to put your energy. And actually, one piece on that I would say is maybe to preempt that is that the utilitarian perspective has, when you say like to relieve suffering over the long term, that has an implicit timescale. So again, we come back to framing. Say one would be happy if there was total utopian world peace. Okay, like what timescale is acceptable for that? 100 years, 1,000 years, 2 million years? Like 100 years sounds pretty great to me. 2 million years sounds like, no, that doesn't feel soon enough. And then you can say the same thing with, okay, say we achieve that. How long is it going to last? Again, is 1 year enough? Is 50 years enough? 2,000 years? And then, so what I'm pointing to here is the wisdom of impermanence, that like you start to see that the framing is always a struggle against impermanence in this present moment. And so there's a kind of letting go of thinking we're actually going to get anywhere other than this present moment. It's always just this. And there will always be suffering, and there will always be relief from suffering. And you just end up back here with a sense of okayness, if we're talking about the contemplative path now, and a sense of, if one feels deeply okay in oneself, then why not try and help others feel better, basically.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just to come back a bit more directly to the book, like something that I thought it was quite interesting that you kind of had this joining together of kind of life itself at the most basic level with consciousness, because I've wrestled with consciousness since forever. And it's a bit of an obsession. And obviously that has always been an option for me. But there's problems with every possible, kind of hypothesis. So I always struggle a little bit of where to fall. And kind of when I read the book, it kind of like forced me to think about a bit deeper, about, this particular, perspective, which is like, it's just life itself. And that's the end of it. However, one thing that I do think you mentioned it in the book, but I think it was very brief, is that I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I'm aware that there's tons of issues about defining life itself. So it's kind of like you're trying to come up with kind of like where to place it, but then there's no border of where to place it. So like, how do you personally view that?
Yeah. So to me, it feels, so we can all recognize life. We can all look at a rock versus a living thing and see the difference perceptually. And we can see when an organism dies. Like there's some data, there's some structure in the systems that we are inferring that there's some phenomenon there. It makes sense to talk about life and death. So the thing you're talking about is, well, how do you formally, precisely characterize that in scientifically, philosophically? My starting point, my hypothesis, or my definition that would be that living systems are, if you want to do it kind of technically in terms of thermodynamics, they're non-equilibrium steady state systems. So they're not dissolved into everything. They're not at equilibrium, because that would be, to be equilibrium, it would be totally dissolved into the environment. So you're not at equilibrium, you've separated, there's some order, and you're in a steady state. You're continuing to stay orderly. So it's a way of describing something that persists in its orderliness. Now that could be true of a drop of oil on some water. So what's different about the drop of oil versus a single-celled organism? And to me, it's what Terence Deacon's he coined this term teleodynamics, which is a kind of goal-directed dynamics of self-persistence. So that's really just a fancy way of describing the thing we all see with living things, is that they're agents who can take actions to avoid death. To me, that is the characterizing thing of a living thing. death doesn't make sense for a non-living thing, because they're not active agents. So you take the structure of a whirlpool when you pull the bath plug out, that it doesn't make sense to talk about the death of that. Again, it's not actively persisting in any kind of autonomous way where it has these teleodynamics of kind of goal-directedness. So to me, that's the presence of those teleodynamics is another way of describing or defining what life is. And we see that there's a kind of attractor dynamics. There's a non-linearity between showing life, showing teleodynamics, and not doing that and collapsing into equilibrium. And that's what we call death. So I think there's a profound non-linearity where I don't think you can hover for any period of time on that threshold between the two. I think it's a liminal transition space. There is no state that can stay in between alive and dead. So yes, that's how I think about life.
Right. And how do you deal with like kind of more like stereotypical edge cases like viruses and like certain proteins that go haywire?
The crucial thing about viruses is even though they're not alive so they don't show this autonomous, goal-directed, these dynamics, they piggyback on life. So it's precisely because life has this engine of kind of keeping itself going actively that viruses arise like this glitch of code that jumps between organisms. That's the correct bigger picture within which to place viruses. Viruses, or if all the cells die on Earth, viruses can't live. They're a secondary phenomenon. They're a glitch within life, as opposed to a living thing by itself. And this comes back to the separation thing. If you frame a virus and you say, no, a virus is a thing that exists for itself, then that's the delusion of object perception. If you see the relationality, you see that in the single fractal of causality that is existence, the place of viruses is entirely secondary to the place of life.
Right. Okay. And I think you tried, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you tried to claim to some degree that if you adopt kind of like this inactivist kind of perspective and kind of like aligning consciousness with life, that then you see the hard problem of consciousness kind of dissolve. And I didn't quite understand how this follows, because especially when you're giving examples, like you give examples of like very basic organisms that are just like eating food and whatnot, like, this, is useful for survival, this is a threat and whatnot, which is very reasonable. But the problem that I have is like, if you go that basic, then to me, it's not immediately clear why that requires experience, like at all. And I think this is also a bit misunderstood. Well, I'm not sure if it's misunderstood because polymers is very complex, but at least in popular conception, I think this is also not appreciated in kind of like the thought experiments of like philosophical zombies, which is like, even though the ability to conceive it is its own philosophical thing, I think a most important aspect of it is like, if you try to have like a godlike perspective and like building organisms, like you can kind of think about it of like starting like very simple, some algorithmic process that you could like code in a spreadsheet, right? And then that eventually gets more complex. And it has all the same behavior that you're describing in your book. And so like, where does experience come in? Like, why is that relevant?
Yeah. So, two things to say on there. First, I want to mention that, so you mentioned this as an activist approach, and I'm careful in the book to differentiate this from enactivism. So for the audience, in case they're not up to speed, enactivism is a pre-existing tradition, which bases mind. It says that basically the ability of organisms to self-persist, to show autopoiesis, this self-creation, is the foundation that then leads to mind through brains in us. And so they had this program of neurophenomenology, of studying the relationship between the brain, the brain and the mind, but was fundamentally based on some level as life being relevant and the mind being fundamentally embodied in the organism. That was not explicitly a biopsychic approach, which is which I'm saying. I'm saying that consciousness is inherently tied to life. You don't need brains, in my opinion. You don't, in a single-celled organism. Evan Thompson, someone in that tradition who wrote a paper a few years ago saying it's possible, biopsychism is possible within an activist theory. It's not a commitment of it. He sees no philosophical reason why it shouldn't be possible to be conscious without a brain. So I just want to differentiate that, because I feel like this is going to be something that in future years is going to be felt into, because I came to this, I was not actually aware of it in the activist tradition when I came up with this idea, because I was coming out of kind of hard science, neuroscience, predictive processing stuff. And I had this radically embodied kind of life intuition. And then I started to read literature. Then I found an activism and was like, okay, how does my idea relate to this? And I was actually going to finish my book by saying, great, now these traditions have come together, and the predictive processing lineage and the activist lineage. Some other people were making similar noises about embodiment in the literature. And then some leading and activist voices published a paper very aggressively saying, no, these are different traditions. They do not play nicely together. So this is extremely technical and to do with commitments of autopoiesis versus the Trinity principle. So I just want to flag that like, I do not think of myself, I do not come from an activist tradition, or I've not been working within that lineage, but I think they're at least superficially very similar, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of researchers in my generation. But the older guard of the inactivists don't like that claim. So that's to be worked out in the literature. So I just want to flag that. But we are in very subtle academia kind of territory here. So to get to your actual question about about consciousness. So it's not that consciousness is an extra thing that is given, that exists in the organism. So the issue of like, well, why would it need to have consciousness? Rather, the issue is, again, it comes down to relationality, but this time in terms of our explanations. So to understand anything is to understand how it exists relationally. So if you say, why is a vision associated with eyes? You would have to tell a whole story of photons, eyes, optic nerve, brain. It's the whole relational picture. There's nothing magical about eyes in and of themselves that makes vision possible. So when you tell a relational picture about what a mind is, what experience is, and you ground it in the physics of life and it holding attitudes about the world and beliefs about the way the world is, which is what I do in the book, I'm trying to describe a similar vision of what I think experience is, what consciousness is. There is no extra thing above and beyond that process that is consciousness. And so the reason I'm committed to that, as I mentioned at the start, is my relational picture is that when you have the relationship being what consciousness is, then it has to be all of life. It can't be a separate brain. We come back to the kind of, the signature of everything starts to add up. I can't prove it. It doesn't, I'm not like, it's not like I had some experience hugging a tree and I've decided it has to be the case that trees can like have experiences. It's like, if you take these assumptions, or if you're open to the possibility, could all life be conscious? Could we have a relational metaphysics? If so, and also like how do predictive processing dynamics in the brain relate to consciousness, and where do they show up in self-organization? Turns out that's at the start, or it's actually even before the start of life, but they're specific. I think the presence of death is what creates semantics and meaning. And there are other people in complexity science working in similar assumptions. So you take all that together and you get this seemingly obvious place where the geodynamics is the necessary puzzle piece to say what brings that relationship of experience into existence. If you try to place it anywhere down the evolutionary time, I see no emergence of any new kind of relationality that could account for consciousness. You would need an extra mechanism, some separate little like, okay, well now there's a bit of the brain that can look at another bit of the brain. As you say, now you're really into the problematic nature of, you've got a spreadsheet with like, okay, well this does this. And like, that's not a problem with a relational picture where you've just got like cellular automata where like things are just interacting, but it is with the gradual evolutionary picture, because how are you going to add something else that just magically makes the experience? Final thing to say on that is that experience too is empty, which is what I've been circling around here, and that there is no. So I recently had a discussion with Jay Garfield, who's a Buddhist philosopher, and he was saying how he doesn't like the term consciousness because it objectifies consciousness. It makes it into a thing. He's a scholar of this emptiness stuff I've spoken about, and I think that's a really great point, that we can talk about seeing as a process, and we can talk about consciousnessing, you might say, like being conscious, but the idea that there is an extra thing that comes into existence, thing is the crucial word here. There can be a process that can emerge, but there is no, the way that Chalmers talks about it is almost like you have to add this extra thing. And I'm saying there is no extra thing to add.
Okay. I agree when you're kind of like trying to project consciousness forward. I think that's very problematic, which is also why I've always thought about this hypothesis that you lay out here has a serious contention. But my inclination is actually the opposite. Like I don't call myself a panpsychist or an idealist or some way, but I try to take it very seriously precisely because I think it actually has less problems if you go onto the other direction. But the issue is, like, when you say, first of all, I don't think it needs to be a thing for the hard problem of consciousness. Like, unless I'm misunderstanding something, like, to me, that's just kind of irrelevant. I think the biggest issue is, like, you have to ask, does this have, like, ultimate reality? Like, is this ontologically real? And the answer of that is yes, obviously. So it's like, so when you're saying,
I wouldn't say yes, obviously. So like this goes back to what we said when we were talking about the self and the desire for there to be some foundational ground, some foundational frame. I agree with you experientially. It's like, this was quite shocking to me when this landed, because I agreed. I thought if there was anything to be known, it was that experience is happening, and it is somehow there's some absolute foundation. There's some way you can grasp that and say, yes, I know that, or that is known, or something like that. And there is no thing called consciousness that is apart from the relationality of existence. There is only that bare relationality. And so it's mind blowing when it lands, and it feels impossible. And the mind says, no, like I need to believe, I need this thought that I am consciousness, or consciousness is some bedrock or some ground. It's the mind really wants that, but if you open to that possibility, it all starts to make sense from my perspective. And it's that thingifying of consciousness. I do think it's this critique of basically it's the critique of dualism and the way that Chalmers articulates it is that you've got the processes of physics, and then so that's the zombie. And then clearly we're a zombie plus experience, this extra thing called experience. And he can conceptualize. So this is the thing. The zombie thought experiment hinges on conceivability. He says we can conceive of a physical automaton that doesn't have experience. I can't do that because I don't thingify consciousness. I can't conceive of pulling them apart. It would be like saying I can conceive of a flying airplane where the airplane and the flying are pulled apart. I'm like, I can't do that. What's the flying without the airplane? And so there is this subtle thingifying of consciousness. And if anyone can conceive of them being pulled apart, there is that thingifying happening.
Yeah. I think that's a metaphor from, how's his name? Anil, something like that?
So I think it might be in Nuances, but someone had a metaphor of you can conceive of a plane flying backwards. Yeah. And it's like, if you have sufficient knowledge of how a plane flies, like I can do that. Fine. It's easy. It just goes that way. But to an aerospace engineer, they understand the flow and the turbulence. They'd be like, no, I literally can't imagine that. Like you're asking me to imagine some silly caricature and not what's actually happening. So same way, like with this theory, I feel like I can no longer imagine pulling apart consciousness from the dynamics of life, basically.
Yeah, I don't think his conceivability argument is that simple. But I think the most important thing, like to me, where I get stuck on kind of like your perspective is that this reality of consciousness to me feels undeniable when you're trying to make the comparison of experience versus non-experience, which I think is, to me, where that's most salient is like with cellular automatons, which is like, there's no reason why you can't do that. And at least from a relatively this is full of problems, but like from a typical basic scientific perspective, you can think about has, higher life has simply very complex cellular automatons, right? And so it's like, you can certainly have the lower one without consciousness, and you can have a higher one with consciousness. So it's like, there's a problem somewhere. Like, I just don't see a way out of that.
It's I want to keep, saying the same thing, but it's the thingifying, and I basically don't expect anyone to agree with me about this because I wouldn't have agreed with myself. Maybe even when I wrote the book, I still was doing a bit of this thingifying a little bit until it really landed that there can just be cellular automata. And cellular automata that behave in a certain way, that behavior is the thing we call consciousness. And the very convincing feeling that there is a thing here called consciousness that is different to to physics is just an idea. It's just not, everything is empty relationality. So actually to offer a different framing that might be a bit more satisfying, the process of seeing is a process of leveraging photons to gain kind of information about the world, you could say simply. The process of consciousness is leveraging our kind of interactions with the world in an epistemic way to hold the world to be a certain way, to simulate the world. That's the mechanism, you could say, or that's the process that I think is consciousness. And that's the process that's in all living things. So that, when I say consciousness is empty or it's not an actual thing, there is a process of epistemicity. There is a process of knowingness, you could say. And that's the thing that can kind of know itself and go, no, there is consciousness. I know that for sure. So to do a bit more justice to that, like that intuition is reasonable in some level, in that consciousness, that knowing knows itself. And so we can use that intellectually as some kind of ground. So that would be my claim, is that if you get cellular automata to start doing genuine epistemic relations, and then you ask the question, where does consciousness come into existence? But you realize that that question is the same question as where does epistemic relations come into existence? There's your answer. So I'm saying consciousness is an epistemic relation. And also just on the conceivability argument, I do think that that is a reasonable way to describe the core of Chalmers' claim. And as Anil Seth has said before, conceivability arguments are kind of astonishingly weak. And because they just depend on what someone's intuitions are. And the reason Chalmers' work was so influential and so important was really it helped people to grapple and to break apart these issues and think, where does that fit in? Not because it proves anything. It doesn't disprove the possibility of a theory of consciousness. He went into kind of dualism, and so it doesn't prove you have to be a dualist. In terms of trying to prove anything, it's a very weak argument. In terms of fleshing out for other people to reckon with these thought experiments, it was incredibly productive. So that's how I see the utility of the conceivability argument, not as showing anything actually to be necessarily the case.
Yeah, I don't think it proves anything, but the way that I think about such thought experiments is more that they force you to reveal your assumptions about what you think is the most real. And so it doesn't prove it, but then it starts this discussion about what are we willing to give up. But when you talk about kind of like this epistemic perspective and about this model building, what I don't understand, and I promise this is the last, I won't start about this any longer, but just to finish off, because I really like the model of having this mental model, and that's very associated with kind of acting in the world and updating your beliefs and whatnot. But again, I just wanted to finish off with why do you think that's associated with experience? Because, for example, I mean, this might not be the best, example. It's just something that came to mind. But just I think 1 or 2 months ago, there was a paper on LLMs that, they build very complex models on their own. Even geometrical ones about spatial relationships. So it's what do you make out of that? You can make the similar case that it's doing exactly the same thing as life is. And then because you equate it to, you're forced to say the LLM is conscious.
So there are two things there. One is the why is the model consciousness? And so the model building process, I'm saying when it's embedded in a teleodynamic system, a system that is acting as if it doesn't want to die, that wants to keep itself going, I'm saying that model building process is the epistemic process that is consciousness. Walper and Kaczynski have this paper about deriving semantic information based around persistence. And so the idea is that meaning can only come into existence with death. Is that's how I've seen it for a very long time. And they're starting to come up with precise, at the Santa Fe Institute, precise ways of measuring that. And so I think that's why, to me, a model that isn't embedded in a system that self-persists doesn't have genuine meaning. It doesn't have that. It's to do with kind of bootstrapping, like a living system. An LLM is an artifact because it's put into existence by an outside intelligence, whereas life has to bootstrap itself. And so the only way it can do that is to be anchored to the world through its own epistemic relations. So with the LLM, if I write down the equations of the free energy principle and the model building and all that kind of stuff and predictive processing on a napkin, no one would think that napkins are now conscious, right? It's really obvious that that's a model of the model. That's a symbolic representation. That's ink on paper. An LLM is a fancy napkin. It's just a fancy way of articulating and modeling. So another analogy people have used is like, it would be like to think that that is conscious would be like thinking that a simulation of a hurricane will get the inside of your computer wet. It's just, it doesn't actually exist at that level of physics or that level of like embodied emergent processes. So I think it's, it's these actual emergent processes that are bootstrapping themselves through epistemic relations is where consciousness comes into existence. If you then come up with a little diorama or some ones and zeros on a computer or a napkin and model that, it's not the same thing. It's just a model.
Right.
Same would be true for driverless car. Driverless car is a model of life, not life itself.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that perspective of the modeling. I think that's why I think that's also why I think the notion of consciousness is so important. But yeah, it's very hard to grapple these things without getting tied up. So to escape a little bit from consciousness, another thing I was curious about is that you mentioned Kant a fair bit, and I've always struggled a little bit with Kant and kind of what to make of it. I almost considered myself a Kantian when I was younger, and now I'm kind of doubting a little bit. And I'm just curious how you think of it and how this kind of plays out in your thesis, because part of it I was very inclined towards it, especially when I started studying kind of psychology and neuroscience, because to me, at least it provides this very basic framework that like what you see is not the world, right? Like it's not the thing in itself. So to me, I see that as very powerful and like a really good framework. But then, first of all, a lot of philosophers, especially within this kind of like inactivist, like 4E cognizant, a lot of them don't like Kant. So I'm just curious where to fall on that. And also another thing is like, there seems to be, if you follow that train of thought, there seems to, not exactly, but it seems to be trending into an anti-realist position, where it's kind of like you can never have like contact epistemology, like it's forever out of reach. And I feel like there's something fundamentally wrong with that, I think. That's just my intuition. And also another thing that you mentioned that's related to this is that you talk about there's a thing in itself, and then there's my perception of it. And everyone else has different perceptions. Animals have different perceptions, but there's no true perception. And I agree with that when you think about like perceptual systems, but I'm not sure at like the deepest ontological level if that's the best way to see it, because then I do feel like if you go that route, then you're forever stuck in the Kantian position. Like you can never get out of it.
Yeah, this is great. So the referencing Kant again shows my prediction processing lineage as opposed to an activist lineage, because you're totally right that there was a kind of divergence in traditions, and the controlled simulation way of thinking about consciousness that is prevalent in predictive processing really is another way of talking about the phenomenal world of Kant. And so in that, when you make that distinction between saying the orange of the fruit is not a noumenal thing, it's something that exists in experience in the phenomenal world, that's incredibly important to know that all of this right now is taking place phenomenally. And for Kant, the noumenon was, forever out of reach. And for me, so the book is aimed at, a kind of popular audience. So I introduce Kant, and I don't go into, I don't actually, it'd be interesting to do this in some more published work, but I don't flag the like moving on from Kant really in the book. So I'm not I don't believe in a firm duality between a noumenon and a phenomenal world. At the moment, I'm reading a book called The Non-Existence of the Real World by Jan Westerhoff, who's a philosopher and scholar of Buddhism at Oxford, who is again based in this tradition of Buddhism. Nagarjuna is the main figure I mentioned. Madhyamaka is the name of the tradition, based on emptiness. And his position is called irrealism. So it is a kind of anti-realist position, which my intellectual preferences, I agree, like it's not the kind of thing that would have appealed to me, but I'm being led there through the philosophy and through the science. And what that would say is effectively, you could say that there is this conventional world of appearances of the phenomenal world, but that only exists interdependently. Like the appearance of the weed depends on my relationship to it as a plant that I don't want in my garden. But there is no, beyond that web of relations, there is no separate foundational thing that is the world. There is no, this comes back to what I said before about the world not being a determinate object that you can pull back from. Now, like, you have to be very subtle with language here, because I don't want to give the impression of just like, oh, nothing exists. Like, it's totally unreal, you know. It's not that. It's a very philosophically nuanced way of describing how it is that things exist. And the way that things exist is conventionally, relationally, without essences. And you could say in a non-actual way. No, I would say that nothing is actual, because for something to be actual would be for it to be solid, real, grounded, exist on its own terms. I'm quite confident in saying that nothing is actual in that sense. There is only, you might want to say, the relational web of existence is actual, but even then, there's no basis on which to make that claim. So this is when you get into the kind of contemplative side of things, where there's a reason that in multiple, Eastern traditions, you end up talking about the potent void, or just like emptiness, nothingness, because it does seem that behind phenomena, even though as much as our brains want to impute actuality, there is a fundamental voidness, groundlessness. And then in the world of form, there's clearly something happening. It's not total absence. So that's why we're in this strange world of, like, in Buddhism, they would describe it as neither real nor unreal, because once you say anti-realism, irrealism, the fear is you go, oh, okay, everything's a total dream, and there are religious traditions that make this kind of claim that utterly negate the world and say this is all Maya appearance. The true world is some transcendent other, which again is dualistic. So yeah, I agree this stuff sounds really out there, but if you go in this direction, I've not found a stopping point where I've seen again and again that this makes sense of things. As much as parts of me really would have liked a solid ground to stand on, the world does seem to be, to me, some relational empty fullness, balance between being and non-being, where there is no solid ground underneath it all.
Like a problem that not a problem, but something that I've always thought within this line of thought of, like, there's no objective point of view. Like, obviously there's very strong arguments for a lot of reasons, a lot of them which already covered. But it has this element that, that things are infinitely categorizable, right? And for example, you give the very, stereotypical example of the river, for example. And obviously, that is true to a large degree. Now, I'm just wondering your thoughts of, like, two issues. Number one is that there is some ways of categorizing which seem to be so related to our embodied existence that, to me, it feels kind of silly to not consider them the foundation. Like, for example, a river, has water. You need water to live, right? So stuff like that. That's one element of it. And the other element is that I feel like when you're considering the infinite categorizations of things, I feel like that downplays the utility of that categorization, because one of the things that really made me pay more attention to, like, religious traditions was that once I looked into them, like, a lot of these abstractions that before I was inclined to say, oh, these are just stories that, either someone came up with or they just arise up naturally, whatever. But then I realized that actually those stories, to me, or at least what the stories are pointing to in a lot of ways, when I apply that in my life, I feel them to be solid. Like, they provide a ground for me to stand on, because that reflects my experience, which I can't get out of it. So it's like, if I'm going to do anything, if I'm going to consider anything as real and anything has my bedrock kind of like foundation, it might as well be what gives, number one, structure to experience, and structure in a positive sense. Like, my life gets better. And I think that also plays a lot that I wanted to get your insight on, just because you're a lot more familiar with this kind of, like, Buddhist train of thought than I am, of like the role of symbols, because that's also something that kind of pulled me away from, like, this very standard, like, materialism, which is like, not only is there all these abstractions that do seem to provide a utility that seems undeniable, but also that a really funny thing is that you can use those abstractions to look deeper into reality. And so you can say, well, those are just like stories and thoughts that you can break apart. So like they don't have a true essence. But then you can just say, if they allow you to look deeper in reality, then they're ultimately real. Because you can say that you're not looking at reality, right? Like reality is just that, like that's the final stopping point of the definition. So I'm just curious, like.
Yeah, this is an excellent place to go next. So, the story example is great. So, you mentioned about concern that when you see there's no objective framing or there's infinite framings or infinite categorizations, it could undermine the utility of specific categorizations that seem reasonable, like seeing water as a drinkable, thing for a human. I would say it doesn't undermine the utility at all, but it does undermine the bondage of thinking that things are a fixed way, and it opens up a flexibility, a freedom of seeing that, things aren't a fixed way. So in the case of the stories, this has been described on the contemplative side as a practice of soul making, which is once you've deconstructed everything and seeing that things aren't a certain way, why not remake them knowing that you're fabricating? Why not tell stories that are beautiful stories that help you live a better life? So this is absolutely aligned and absolutely a very wise place to take this, which actually is quite rare in spiritual practices. So I'm interested in advocating for this to some extent. So I totally agree with what you say, that like the ground you experience as a way to move forward in the world through a certain narrative is a totally reasonable ground. But you're not running up to physicists saying you need to take Joseph Campbell's thing and incorporate, that's going to solve the relationship between quantum mechanics and gravity. You're not mistaking it for some metaphysical ground in some sense there, unless you are. Maybe we could get into a subtle discussion there. Maybe there are deeper truths being pointed to in certain narratives. But in terms of how you live your life, I think that doesn't need to be the case. And then, so the other thing is to say that when it comes to there being reasonable stories, reasonable conceptualizations, framings, so you could say actual apples they're a collective dream. So you take an apple tree and a bunch of humans come together and we can eat apples, and we look at them, and if we think that those apples exist as apples in their own right, and that's the correct, that isn't even a framing, that is just what they are, then we would be mistaken. Because if you remove all the humans, you say you remove all life on Earth, is it accurate to say they're apples, or are they just subatomic particles? If you take away the utility of them being eatable by an organism, what would it mean to say they're an apple? So that's the emptiness thing, which is, so Jay Garfield describes this as saying everything is illusory, because an illusion is something where something's mode of appearance is different to its mode of existence. So an apple on a tree appears as an apple, as an object, a single apple. If its mode of existence was that it just was a single apple that had its own independent existence, then it wouldn't be illusory. It would just be actual. It would be what it appears to be. But actually, the apple depends on not only the whole tree and the sun and everything else. It depends on our being a creature that can eat it. And to call it an apple is a linguistic convention that English speakers use. Is it an apple to a Portuguese person? No, it's a different word, right? Which I do know, but I'm not going to try and pronounce, even though it's simple. And so that shows the kind of everything is like that. Everything only exists conventionally and interdependently in that way. So as social primates, we can get into a collective dream where I'll say, no, this guy's crazy. That's an apple, right? And you go, yeah, that's an apple. I can eat it. You can eat it. But just because there's more people playing the dream, it's a multiplayer dream, it doesn't mean that it is actually an apple in any objective, actual sense.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
But you can still get sustenance from it, because the flip side of emptiness is actually, it's not fully a negation. It's the fact that things, it's an explanation of how things exist. So apples can give you sustenance precisely because they take the energy from the sun and then that can go into you. Those webs are what give things their actual causal power. So that's the crazy thing, is that we feel like if things lacked actuality, they would not be causal. But the absolute opposite is true. All the causality is in the whole. And so it's only by not being separate that you can have causal power, which is when that lands is kind of mind blowing, because our minds really think, no, like biliable A hits biliable B. That's what causality is. But everything is actually influenced and constrained in this very decentralized way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And something that I don't like too much is when we're talking about kind of like predictive processing, and also when you give all these examples about kind of like how basic life gets started and like how beliefs operate and whatnot. The thought that always comes to mind, which I'm not super well versed in like predictive processing, but the idea that I get is that this applies both to the examples that you're giving and also predictive processing more broadly and how it's used, is that it's often about kind of like how you update your beliefs and like how you act in the world. But then what I think is super important, that's more important than that. Like, that's kind of like a cognitive mechanism of like how you operate in the world. But then pulling the strings of that, there's a value system, right? And I don't think predictive, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think predictive processing covers that too much unless it's very actively tied to survival. So like, it makes sense when it's like at the lowest level, but then you come to a human being and like, that's not how human beings operate in the world. Like, they're moved by values. They're moved by things that matter. And also, I think a really potent example as well, and I think that's partially of what makes the story so powerful, is that all this bottom-up model that you're describing is like very survival based. And when you think about, okay, what is the human experience most special about? And most people have conceptualized to some degree has, some intimation of the sacred. Let's put it this way for the sake of it. And then, at least, obviously this is very biased, but let's say at least in the West, like one way that has been conceptualized is through agapic love of self-sacrifice, which then completely undermines like the model that you just started.
That's great. Yeah, that's really good. So no one's posed that to me in that way before, and I'm really excited to explore this because I utterly hold to that agapic self-sacrifice being a hugely important aspect on the kind of metaphysical level, and that through the level of the physical, everything is playing out through survival dynamics. So I'm interested to hear how I'm going to answer this because I actually haven't. I can feel in my mind they align. So, all right. So to work through this step by step, the reason I talk about predictive processing is it's not so much a kind of cognitive human level thing. It's more of my deeper commitment is to the free energy principle as a formal description of universal Darwinism, you could say. So I think the only naturalistic causality is through self-persistence. So this was Darwin's insight, that things that are good at persisting persist, and that accounts for the complexity of the world. And the free energy principle is basically saying that it gives a formal description of how that process happens with this quantity called free energy, effectively things that are surprised, things that are always having things happen to them that are not aligned with their survival won't survive very long. So in order to survive, there needs to be some modeling, and that model needs to be leveraged to minimize surprise. This does happen. You can model simple things like a drop of oil in the same way, even though at that point you could say we're kind of metaphorically importing things like surprise. Surprise is an informational construct, so you shouldn't think of them as being minded, in my opinion. But anyway, my point is that from there you get life and you get brains all having this survival imperative, which is it creates a kind of resonance with the world, which is what I think is the foundation of consciousness, that these models have to resonate with the wider world in order for us to survive. So I think all of human meaning is cashed out in terms of survival. I think you could build up the biggest narrative you want about what your life is about, but ultimately I think Ernst Becker was right about the denial of death, that it's all fabricated. It's all this kind of fabrication of like, I don't want to die, so I'm gonna, that's secondary to like all cultural practices, everything we care about is ultimately cashed out from evolution, I think, and survival more deeply, in that you want a nice house because you want social status, because if you have and shelter, and if you have social status, then you have more resources, and it all cashes out because I want to survive more. Now, that's what I think is happening through form, through physics, through self-persistence, through life and mind. Now there is this other aspect, which is the spiritual dimension, the contemplative dimension, which is not, that makes it sound like something other than, it's playing out in the same, it's not something other, it's not separate from this kind of thing. But when one has so when you say this kind of this agape, this love, this self-sacrifice, to me, my metaphysics is really based in a core unconditionality. So that's another way of saying non-finite, non-framed, non-bounded is not conditioned, not limited in any way. And so I think the fundamental core of existence is some expressive prime mover creativity, which is very much how people have spoken about God in, Christian traditions. I don't typically use that word, but I do think it makes sense they talk about that there's like this outpouring, which everything is then scaffolded on top of. And I think our mammalian experience of love is built upon a metaphysical foundation of unconditionality. Now, I'm a scientist, and saying this stuff is this is speculative. This is not provable. But experientially, I think when people have the experience that the universe is made of love, that is not a platitude or some hokey, silly thing to say, it's wishful thinking. I think what they're really articulating is, I felt that the source and totality of existence is an outpouring of unconditionality, and that is generative, and that is what I am, and that's what everything is. And I would say that, and so in that, really the wisdom of self-sacrifice in the service of love. You look at a figure like Jesus as a kind of archetypal figure of this. What's happening there, in my opinion, is a metaphysical rupture, you could say, or because all of the self-persistence dynamics are playing out within this larger metaphysics of unconditionality. It's basically like a kind of the self-persistence dynamics just kind of fail because this bigger thing takes over, which is this coming home to the present moment through seeing that your core nature is the same core nature as everything in existence. I don't think that happens because of Darwinian survival dynamics. I don't think that's a brain thing. I mean, the brain aligns to make it possible, but I think that is a far more fundamental revelation of our existential situation that doesn't have a reason, doesn't have a cause. Actually, the cause, I guess, would be typically, I think in us, the conceptual mode that serves our survival over time allows us to override basic homeostatic drives. And that can accumulate a lot of stress and prediction error and suffering. And I think when we give up on that mode and we just say no, like I did when I was ruminating and I couldn't figure out the answer, what happens is you collapse into a present moment homeostasis. And that's where you're really in touch with the basic flow of life. And so I think the utility of that surrender is the utility of shifting you into a more simple organismic mode. So I think these things come together here. There's a question mark, I guess, in my mind around whether the self, so is there an evolutionary persistent story to be told about Jesus? Someone or priests not having kids, and you could tell a story about how it offers a collective, when everyone's in this suffering mode of concept, it's an invitation to the collective organism of humanity to drop into your homeostatic, simpler suffering mode. So actually the form of a figure like Jesus, I can imagine actually it showing some logic that does fit in with this persistence dynamics, but the experience itself is deeper than that. So, that's how I see those things adding together. But it's interesting because I do think they're consistent, even though they sound completely inconsistent. I guess it's also because I don't believe in, if you frame Jesus as an individual and you say what matters is the survival of this particular individual, that's not the kind of persistence dynamics I'm talking about. I'm talking about, again, the single fractal of existence where forms are inherently related to each other. And so really you want to be thinking about the persistence of the human collective. And if one individual has to die to facilitate some reckoning, something that is beneficial to the whole, I can imagine that being evolutionarily built into the system, that we have priests that, serve a certain role to help other people in the community have kids, but not everyone. We aren't actually separate individuals who all need to be having kids.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I do think the evolutionary perspective is a bit tricky, but that would be a huge rabbit hole.
I mean, this is the universal Darwinism thing. It's like a persistence perspective that's deeper than just like evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory is a secondary thing, but no, I mean, I guess I'm a Darwinist to my core in that I think I've never seen another explanation as to why forms exist. And I think it's a beautiful explanation that does all the heavy lifting we need.
Right. Yeah. So in Buddhism and also in kind of the framework that you're presenting, there's a lot of this aspect of unity, precisely because reality is a monads, I suppose you can call it, something like that. Like it's a self-sustaining thing that is not invisible and completely boundless. Now, at least in Christianity, there's this issue of trying to solve the issue of the one and the many, like at a philosophical level, although even then it applies like in your life as well. And in Buddhism and Eastern traditions in general, I think even more in Hinduism, but I don't want to speak too strongly about it because I might mess up, but there's this issue of like the unity is what matters, and therefore you're supposed to dissolve into the unity. But then I think what that tends to happen is that tends to actually fracture reality to some degree, because then you're kind of like, you're breaking down identity, basically. And one of the things that I found so interesting in the Christian tradition is that obviously there's the whole issue of unity. It's like, that's the whole purpose of like having theosis, with God, but then it's also put in this context, like a very deep metaphysical level where logos is love, and love can be seen or defined as going towards the one. So there's a purpose, there's a group that's coming together towards something, so that there's the form of the group, we can think of it, right? But the individual is not supposed to lose itself in the group. And it's actually quite funny, because when you think about kind of like Eastern mysticism, you see that at least from a superficial level, maybe I'm wrong, it seems that a lot of emphasis is put into the union. But with Christianity, that's not the case. And what I found so interesting was that you can actually see that playing out in life, precisely because you see that if the union takes over, then reality ceases to exist. Like you fractured the group, because now there's no individuals that partake of the group. And so I'm just curious of like, how do you see this interplay between the one and the many, the individual and the group? And if you think that's an issue, if you think, identity doesn't break down, or if it should break down, if that's the goal.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned, that a lot of traditions emphasize the unity. I think that's because the duality comes for free. Like we're really embedded with this sense of self. And so to counteract that, there's this invitation to move towards unity. But you're absolutely right that this is a really important terrain to make sure people don't end up in some transcendent, subtly dualistic orientation, where they negate the conventional. So again, it's alive in my head because I recently had this conversation with him, but Jay Garfield languages this as, saying that we should think of ourselves as persons, not as selves. And the subtle distinction there is that a self is thought to be a genuinely separate thing that exists, doesn't actually exist. So it's illusory. And then a person, in this moment, I'm turning up as a person. So there's an embodied organism here. I'm drinking from this cup of water because it's the one that's been assigned to me. I'm not drinking from yours. I take my son to school. I don't take someone else's son to school. There's like these conventional ways in which you show up in the relative. So in that way, the person isn't that personness doesn't dissolve. That personness doesn't get lost, and that can still be there. But I do think that there's that way of thinking can be leveraged to bypass the possibility of a deeper surrender into the union, because it just is a delusion that there are separate selves. It's just nothing is separate. And so that is the deeper truth. So I want to hold both, but you could say, the ultimate truth is ultimate for a reason, because it is more foundational. It is true to say that there are no separations. But then on the conventional level, things can exist conventionally, So like if you thought something like when kids, believe in Father Christmas, Santa Claus, they can be upset to learn that Santa Claus isn't real. But then as adults, we can still enjoy the imagery of it and the narratives of it and understand that it does exist as a story and it exists as a conventional construct, and there can be enjoyment there. So the child's initial reaction is, oh, like, you know, it doesn't exist at all. And the neurosis there on this path is to then say, the term Santa Claus, the term Father Christmas, has absolutely no referent in reality. That's not true. It does have a referent. It's just a narrative concept, construct. And so everything's like that. You know, you don't stop eating because you've seen the emptiness of food. It still nourishes you, and it's still, just because it's an empty process doesn't mean you can't sharpen the relative. So, I think Zen Buddhism does a really good job of articulating this. It's a path of truly radical deconstruction of the self, if undertaken seriously, that leads you back to where you began, where often the practices are just be fully present with what you're doing. You know, just doing the washing up is, if you're fully present with it, that is the deepest, coming full circle. You don't need to be in some transcendent other. It's just this conventional reality, but free from the delusion of separation and struggle.
Okay, but is it the deepest? Because here's the issue, because you seem to make that has like your foundation. But for example, when you give the example of the Santa Claus as the story, like obviously there's an element of enjoyment for the kids, but there's also the issue of true being. It's like the Santa Claus, the idea does exist and it's embodied in individuals, right? And then the issue is like, how valuable is that true being? And number one, you can apply that to stories, which is kind of like what I was trying to say earlier about the symbols. But I think what I want to highlight now is like, if you think about that, some level of unity is required through individuality. When that is true of love, of a relationship. Now the question is, because that's required for being, like, do you hold that as less real than the fundamental unity that you're talking about?
Which love? Conventional, relational love in a relationship?
The fact that love requires this like combination of unity and individuality, compared to that unity is the complete bedrock, because everything else is just a construct.
So when I said unconditionality, I mean, I mentioned how I think love is kind of scaffolded on it. But yeah, I think that what I'm talking about there is a kind of, I think it's the phenomenon of transpersonal love that people come across where it doesn't have two sides. It's just fully embracing as everything. So it's not a relational love. That to me does seem to be most fundamental. And relational love is a more fabricated, state. Yeah. I don't know if that addresses the question.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to make sure I didn't misunderstand you. So like, because I'm trying to, because when you mention kind of these different two types of love, what I'm trying to highlight more is the fact that, let's consider a relationship, right? Like, would you view the unity with less individuality to be a more real, desirable state?
So the thing that I'm talking about here is not to do with desirability necessarily, or what we should do. It's more that, so I guess the term real is relevant, even though that's a bit difficult because it's not actual, but it's like the most undiluted state is to see everything just is what it is and there are no separations. That's the clearest seeing, in my opinion. And in that, there's a relief from suffering. So the terrain I'm talking about is really, if someone is suffering, they can let go of that framework of thought that seems to separate the world, and let go of the bondage of that and abide in, liberation from that suffering. Now, the question, that's a radical project. We're talking here really about the difference, in Buddhism, it would be between monks versus householders, people who are interested in going on the intense full path versus people just trying to get on with their lives. The recommendations for the average person trying to get on with their lives, the thing that I recommend is basically opening up to this present moment, that is the direction of the whole path. And so as you open up, you let go of self-based struggle, self-based, separations, and the intellectual question. The intellectual question about, is this why? Should we do this? Those are typically resistance patterns that will try and block that surrender. So this is very deep embodied surrender. And so for some of us, it takes us over because we can just feel the pull of peace, or the suffering is too much, which is the same thing, pushes in that direction. And so the best I can say is it happens for some people because they feel called to it, and because they crave groundedness, reality, whatever you want to call it, and peace. Intellectual ideas about what people should do is really kind of another story, which we can talk about. I mean, I guess because if you want to relieve suffering, this is the direction. And I guess what I'm saying is, if it's done through this, if you have this two truths, which is what's called in Buddhism, model from the start, where you're not negating the conventional reality, you're not negating the Santa does exist as a story, then you can settle into having your cake and eating it, in terms of surrendering deeply into the unity whilst being a person and not needing to act neurotically. Whereas if you just have the unity piece, then you could start to have these subtle egoic things of like, I'm really special because I'm really spiritual or whatever, which are their own kind of subtle dualities. If you map it onto human relationships, that's a analogy that I don't really know how to make, really.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. So just for the last question, we've been going at it for a while. So I'm writing my dissertation right now, which is about psychedelics, and in one of the sections, I really want to cover this aspect that I see a convergence for a lot of different places about a fundamental duality that is not ultimately a duality. And loosely speaking, kind of some of the things that I mentioned is kind of like that if you look at complexity systems, and you see a lot of like chaos and order type thing. If you look at the brain, you also see lots of things about kind of this balancing between the two. We also see this in mystical experiences, but again, there's this kind of like this balance that is achieved of kind of having this peak state. And then you also see this a lot in religious traditions. Obviously, you see that most famously in Taoism, but then you also see it in Zen. You also see it in Christianity. There's a lot of kind of like the right hand and the left hand, well, the other way. But there's also plenty of other dualities about kind of like the heaven and earth and the meeting of the two and whatnot. But then, like, all these dualities exist, but they exist in this way where, the true reality is found in the middle. And obviously that's almost by definition non-duality. But every time I go write non-duality, like, that feels uncomfortable because it feels like I'm denying the reality upon which non-duality exists. So I know you talk about non-duality a lot, so I'm just curious how you.
Yeah, this balance of order and disorder, chaos and order is exactly what I'm working on now. So your intuitions, I think you're really onto the right thing that we should be paying attention to in terms of, I think that dynamic runs deep, and thoroughly. And yeah, so as you mentioned, you think of the yin yang symbol. Taoism is a thoroughly non-dual tradition, yet its symbol looks dualistic, has the black and the white, but crucially, it's a unity through a duality, which maybe if we get rid of the word duality, we could call it a dialectic. Being depends on non-being. Order depends on chaos. What would order be without the possibility of chaos? It would be nothing, And I think you could say, when I was talking about being and non-being earlier, or empty fullness, you could say reality is everything and nothing at once. It's like the total exertion of existence being everything and nothing. The foundation is totally empty, but the expressiveness of this is just totally full. So I think that's what Taoism really captures that. And it is a non-duality ultimately, because of the relationality, because up is up, is up and down a duality, or is it a single thing that is mutually dependent, So in Taoism, you do have the Tao, the one, you could say, that gives birth to the yin and the yang, that then spins out into the 10,000 things, which is, like all of the perceived things of the world. And I think that's a kind of reasonable, I do think polarization is an absolutely crucial That's the first step of relationality, is a dialectic, is a this, not that. So that's how form takes place, is through an apparent duality, but it's only apparent because, again, up doesn't have essence of up without it being, it only exists with reference to down. And the same is true of order and chaos and everything and nothing. And yeah, that unity through seeming duality is foundational, I think.
Yeah, amazing. So actually, one last question just before we finish off. So like, is there anything that, after writing the book that you thought that you really wish that you could have included, but you couldn't out of logistics or because you couldn't come up with it at the time?
Interestingly, yesterday I was thinking about the Kant thing you mentioned, that like I was just reflecting on how I think people could probably come away with thinking that I have a duality between the noumenon and the phenomenal world. And it wasn't supposed to be a philosophical treatise of trying to kind of get into, so I introduced it in its right place to talk about predictive processing. But yeah, I guess that's something it would have been nice to put in the clause, just to be like, don't think this is like a strict Kantian perspective. That's a bit of a technical thing. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And it served as a great foundation, as I say, to now go into more practical human relief of suffering stuff. So yeah, watch this space for there's going to be more new, different stuff built on top of that. That's very much just a foundation. I wrote that because I seem to have some utter compulsion to be deeply thorough with, like, as a scientist, I can't just do the science. I need to do the metaphysics and the philosophy and build up a kind of complexity science all the way through to the life and the brain. And for whatever reason, that's the way I work. So that's the foundation. That's the prequel almost for what's going to come next, hopefully.
Right. Okay. Amazing. So yeah, thank you once again for joining me. Thank you for everyone watching. Highly recommend his book. Make sure to order it if you like his perspective. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks.